Thanks so much. I am so appreciative of this opportunity, and I bet you're having a great time. So over the past 4 years, we've really been able to build upon the previous work of the National Endowment for the Arts and also launch some new projects. We awarded $430 million over the past 4 years to support arts projects in all 50 states, U.S. territories, and all 435 congressional districts. When we expanded our Creative Forces Military Healing Arts Initiative from 2 sites in Maryland and Virginia to 12 sites across the nation, from Alaska to Florida, we reached exponentially more service members and veterans with brain recovery conditions. When we launched the $2 million in Creativity Connects grants to connect arts projects with science, technology, healthcare, agriculture, aging, and other non-arts sectors, we stepped away from that old paradigm that the arts are often a corner by themselves. When we launched the economic research, we revealed that the arts are a net export gain for the United States, and they contribute to the economy of the state. When we created the NEA Musical Theater Songwriting Challenge for high school students, and we connected them with current Broadway performers and musicians, we discovered this amazing talent of high school songwriters from across the nation. When we visited Cuba and China to begin artist exchanges between the NEA and their ministers of culture, we brought countries together closer through the arts. We were ranked #1 in the small agency category of 2016 Best Places to Work in the federal government, and we're so appreciative of the 3 back-to-back increases in the NEA budget from Congress in 2016, 2017, and 2018, and it looks like we're moving in the right direction to receive a 4th increase for 2019. The Senate still has to vote on this later in June, so cross your fingers and braid your hair, but we're all in this together. But what's really been meaningful is that in my travels to the 50 states and 200 communities and making more than 400 site visits, I've talked with visual artists and musicians and dancers, actors, writers, filmmakers who are powerfully shaping America's culture. And arts organizations are not only providing programs for audiences, they're also seen as leaders in their communities because the arts can bring people together. And neighborhood residents from communities, large and small, densely populated, remote, rural, they're coming together and they're commenting about how they have personally been affected, how their vitality is energized because of the arts in their communities. And that's why I wanted to be here today with you to thank you for the work that you're doing, because together, each in our own ways, we are creating an environment where the arts can thrive and we can especially spark that vitality in communities. So I want to thank and express my appreciation to Rocco Landesman, 10th chair of the National Endowment for the Arts, for launching the Our Town Creative Placemaking grants when he was at the NEA. Those grants inspired so many of us to jump on the bandwagon and expand the concept of creative placemaking through ArtPlace, because we could all see that the arts played such a key role in bringing vitality to communities of all sizes. And we are still continuing the role at the NEA with the Our Town projects. And in case you are interested in applying for the next round, which is in August, please talk with Jen Hughes, Catherine Bray-Simons, and are they here today? Could you just pop up there, the people waving? Feel free to ask them any questions you want. And today, we have a very distinguished panel who will share about their own discoveries of the towns across the United States, especially the smaller ones, and what some might regard as those hidden gems of how communities come together and celebrate those characteristics that make each community unique. So when I traveled across the United States over the past 4 years, I traveled in commercial airliners and Amtrak trains, but for more than 4 years, James Fallows and Deborah Fallows traveled some 100,000 miles across the U.S. in a single-engine prop airplane, and they talked with folks in dozens of towns about what makes their communities so very special. James Fallows has been a national correspondent for The Atlantic magazine for more than 35 years. He has reported from China, Japan, Southeast Asia, Europe, and across the U.S., as we'll hear about today. He's authored 11 previous books. His work appeared in many other magazines and as public radio commentaries since the 1980s. He's won a National Book Award, a National Magazine Award, and for 2 years he was President Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter. Deborah Fallows is a linguist and a writer who holds a PhD in theoretical linguistics. She has written for The Atlantic, National Geographic, Slate, New York Times, and The Washington Monthly. She's the author of 2 previous books. I had read one of her earlier books called Dreaming in Chinese, and it was about their travels to China in the 1980s. And instead of just telling us about the definitions of various Mandarin words like a highly trained linguist would do, she deftly extracted the personalities and the dynamics of the Chinese people who lived out those Mandarin words. So when I learned about that the Fallows would be here and that they were going to talk about their latest book, Our Towns, I got very excited, because I knew that this book would not just be a checklist of travel guides of what they saw during their travels. Instead, it's going to be a much deeper and a much more meaningful description of why people and towns are the way they are. And then moderating the panel today is Javier Torres. Javier is the director of the Thriving Cultures program at the Surdna Foundation, and many of you remember Javier in his previous position as the director of national grant making at ArtPlace, as well as yes, indeed, as well as the senior program officer for the arts at the Boston Foundation, director of Boston's Via Victoria Center for the Arts. So welcome all, and I'm going to pass the baton to you, Javier.
So much, Jane. So I'm so incredibly thrilled to be here with all of you and to be here with Deb and Jim, who I think are some of the few people in this country that have gotten to see as much of the country as I have. I owe a great amount of gratitude to Jamie and the ArtPlace staff and team and funders for giving me the opportunity over 3.5 years to travel to meet all of you. And it is those visits, it's been those conversations that have reminded me about the hope of why we are the great communities that we are. So excited to have this conversation today. I'm going to start with the format that I learned from the Aspen Institute team. And I'm going to start by asking Deb and Jim, why do you do what you do?
So I will start. Deb will then, as you'll very quickly see, Deb will correct and trim and say what I should have said. First, before even saying why I do what I do and why we do what we do, I just want to say how grateful Deb and I are to be here. To Javier, to Jamie, to Jane Chu, to be with all of you, because we feel as if over the last couple of years we've been exposed to the kind of thing you're doing, and we have a sense of how important it is and what kind of movement you all are making. And we'll say later on, well, that's actually maybe the segue to why I do what I do. So in terms of journalism, I feel as if I've been lucky to have the one job on earth that is perfectly suited for me for a very long time, which is writing for The Atlantic, which has a high-end print audience and a broad online audience. And the Atlantic has equipped me to do the two things that reporters live to do. One is to find out, to go places, see things, whether it's a Chinese coal mine or a public arts project in Central Oregon or whatever it might be, and then to share what you've seen. So the whole motivating thread through my long career as a writer for The Atlantic and reporter for public radio and a book writer has been to explore things around the world and in our country, and then to tell people about what it is, what we have seen. And I think never, it's fair to say, never in our long time together have we felt as much intensity and passion and hope as we do right at this moment of trying to share the stories of what we've seen from all of you and your colleagues like you across the country, and the way in which, at a moment of such distress for the nation in its national governance, where nobody of any political affiliation can be that happy with the tone of national affairs, to see the renaissance and the reform and the renewal and the energy and the independence that's happening so many places across the country. So that's the reason I do what I do is to learn and to tell, and the reason I feel real passionate at this moment is from learning from people like you and hoping for the foreseeable future to tell and share your stories.
And I would like to add my thanks onto what Jim has said, because truly, the introduction from Jamie and his colleagues at ArtPlace and to ArtPlace and what you all do in your towns has transformed the experience that we've had going around the country. We're not artists. We don't consider ourselves artists. But learning from your hearts and souls how you put your passions into what you do and what we've seen as far as the effects and impacts that those have had on the towns that we've visited, I feel like we're finally getting some natural instinct in our own unartistic souls of what all that means. And we are complete evangelists for you all now and really believe in what you're doing. So thanks for having us here. So we've lived long enough that I have done, I would consider, 3 main things in my life. I spent 18 years raising kids, and that to me was a passion, and I loved every minute of it, and they turned out okay. And the linguistics, I'm very relieved to hear that Jane Chu pretty much says what I pretty much did in this book about Chinese is right, so that I loved learning Chinese when we were in China. And now there's this new passion of writing about the places that we are going around to see. And as Jim said, it's been maybe better than raising kids, but don't say that.
No, you can't say it. So this is being heard outside this room.
Okay.
You can't say that.
No, it equals raising kids. It's probably better than being in China was, where every day we were like, you're never going to believe what I saw. Here, it's you're never going to believe what I saw each day at the dinner table.
And just, can I make one more China comparison? So you tell me when I'm done, and I can.
Okay,
you're done.
I'm
I can
done.
Okay. So when we were in China, every day we come back saying, "Good Lord, you can't believe what we saw that day." And Deb filled her book, praised by Oprah. She filled her book with those anecdotes. And in those days, what we were saying sort of fit what everybody expected about China. Oh yeah, of course China is on the rise. So if you tell me that you've seen a 300-foot tall statue of Mao made out of gold, I'll believe it, because anything is plausible in China. But we feel now we have the same intensity, but most people don't know it. Most people don't know that the kinds of things they're seeing in their town are happening so many other places. So we feel as if we're sort of working against the prevailing mood and trying to get these stories across.
So that's a perfect segue. One of the major themes that we've talked about and that I've actually heard in my time doing this work is that actually getting your story heard is a challenge so many people face. We all face it in getting elected officials to support or understand the work or the transitions that we're having in our communities, to speak with funders, to get them to write checks and to support the work. And what you two do is to really help craft and amplify the stories of the communities across this country. So I would love for you two to talk about the importance that narrative has played in your life, and how do you think that amplifying those narratives will help change and strengthen our communities?
So is one of our microphones making a sound? That's some extraneous sound. I will just ignore that. So we all know that storytelling is basically the way people learn, the way they exist. And while I realize, I feel in my own life a tension between the high school debater organization approach to things, saying, here is my point, here are the counter-arguments, here's why the counter-arguments are wrong, here's why you should agree with me. That's one way I naturally think, but I recognize the things that stay with me are the stories, and that illustrating these stories are ways that people can understand the difference it makes in a town. And I'll just, there are a million illustrations, but one that really was vivid to us, is there anybody here from either Columbus, Starkville, or West Point, Mississippi? The so-called Golden Triangle of Mississippi. So we spent a lot of time there. Which of the towns are you from? Columbus. So you know MSMS, the Mississippi School of Math and Science in Columbus. And it was so riveting to us the way this public boarding school in Mississippi took kids from all around the state And while its title is Mississippi School of Math and Science, and they have math and science, it seems to us that social sciences and history and arts were the real genius of the school. And the plays they put on with a mixed-race cast of students reenacting the Reconstruction era in that town, and the Jim Crow era in that town, the Civil Rights era in that town. These were stories of the individual people that just made vivid to people of both races, of all races in that part of Mississippi now, a kind of living connection to their history, which didn't erase any of the history, but was one way just of making it part of real daily life they wouldn't have had otherwise.
And there's a similar story, which is surprisingly in Duluth, comes from Duluth, Minnesota, where they are in the process of coming to terms with what people in Duluth consider their most horrific element of their past, which was a lynching that happened in Duluth in 1920. A circus came to town, there were African-American workers, there was a young woman who had alleged, false, later determined false, that a few of the workers had raped her. The police came and rounded up 6 workers, threw them in prison, and that evening, the townspeople took 3 of them and hung them from a lamppost in the center of town. So about 80 years later, this story resurfaced in the newspaper, and it kind of rekindled the emotion around all of that, of coming to terms with something. And one of
8 years ago, yeah. Or was it 1928? Yeah.
No, 80
Okay,
years
yeah,
after
yeah.
that happened, right, roughly. So they built in a square that was just a piece of empty land opposite the kitty corner of this lamppost, a most beautiful little park that had life-size, it was granite and bronze, so it had life-size images, larger than life-size, of the 3 men, and some nice sayings around it, and they put some places where people could sit and talk and look. And the power of telling that story, and then the power of trying to recognize what that story meant, that this was not just a story of what happened, but it was a reckoning, a reconciling, a coming to terms of something. I think that was an example of what we learned from so many different kinds of artistic creations, performances, murals, whatever it would be in the towns that we came to, not only to see them, but to help understand through that story what this was getting at, whether it was coming to terms with something, whether it was celebrating something in the town, or whether it was just kind of an outpouring of creative talent in the town that kind of brought people together. But taking that story to the next level of explicitly saying what that meant in the town, I think was what we learned from storytelling, and especially the storytelling about art, which is so powerful in its backstory.
Amazing. So I'm going to invoke another author, Adrienne Marie Brown, who reminds me that what we pay attention to on a daily basis is what grows. And these narratives that we receive from media all over can often sort of obfuscate what we really see or what's really important. And that often is just the interpersonal, it's the relationship, it's the love that we can share with each other. We don't talk about love in our work, despite the fact that we say we want to change the world. So I'm curious, as you know, love is a thing that I have found in meeting all of you. Love for your place, love for your neighbors, love for the history, love for the future. I'm curious, as the two of you have traveled, what are some of the trends that you're seeing that we're getting right in this country?
You want to? So.
No, go ahead.
I'm trying to choose which story to give in the finite time we have here. And actually, you'll see, I understand that many of you have copies of our book, conveniently called Our Towns, in connection with your project, which is basically organized as a set of stories, a sort of city by city by city stories of what we saw going around. And one of the sort of analytical definitions we saw on the character, on the trait of love, is people in many places saying they loved this place. I have a chapter about Charleston, West Virginia. I don't know if anybody's, so Charleston, West Virginia, which is centered on a man named Larry Gross, who many of you know, who's the host of Mountain Stage, talking about how he grew up in Texas, was working as a very successful songwriter in Los Angeles, and had I think a NEH grant to go be a songwriter in residence in West Virginia like 40 years ago, and stayed there because he said he loved it. He loved the people, he loved the landscape, he loved the reality of it. He loved all the connotations, as he saw it properly, of being a hillbilly, being generous and smart and for real, and putting up with no BS. And so we saw in many, many ways chronicles somebody who decided to spend his career in Eastport, Maine. Some of you may have been there. It's an ArtPlace venue. People who love my hometown of Redlands, California, decide they're going to build their businesses there. But analytically, this idea of local patriotism was very strong. I'll give you one other brief story which involves a variant of love, and involved Deb too. We spent a lot of time in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. You know, if any of you are here, it's a beautiful, it's a really interesting city with lots of beautiful public art downtown with their falls. And it's become a very important refugee resettlement place. This area that had been historically either Germanic or Nordic, you know, the two big divisions were the Germans and the Norwegians in the population, now is a significant Somali and Sudanese and Congolese and Nepalese population drawn there. And there was a young woman whose story in brief was, as a child, she'd been in Darfur and walked across Darfur at age 6 and got separated from her family and was away from them for years and years, and was miraculously reunited, went to Sioux Falls, went to the high school there, was successful, and became a very leading ROTC candidate in Sioux Falls High School. But the problem was she, unlike all the other ROTC students, could not wear her ROTC uniform on Fridays for ROTC uniform day because she wore a hijab, and the ROTC rules did not allow for that. They'd historically allowed for yarmulkes, but not for hijabs. So, and the girl was feeling bad about this. Deb wrote about this on the Atlantic site. The South Dakota Adjutant General said, we'll look into this. The National ROTC structures changed its rules to allow for Muslims to also to join on dress day, and people in Sioux Falls were expressing this as part of their love for the expanded community that was making up their town. So that was a kind of love for the new citizens of their town.
And there's another one that we saw in many of the towns we visited, which is we'll call them young people. Everyone's younger than we are these days anyway, but 30, give or take 5 years, let's say that. People who, maybe they grew up there, maybe they went to college there. For some reason, they were returning there or being determined to stay there because this was their town. And they just loved their town for the same kinds of reasons Larry Gross in Charleston said he loved this town. It was something they were proud of, something that they wanted to make better, and they were tired of hearing the grumpy old people say, San Bernardino is a hellhole, I don't want to be here anymore. Erie, Pennsylvania, dreary Erie on the lake. This is not a place for us. And in place after place, we saw the young people, often artists, coming together in a way to take a stand and improve. San Bernardino, California is a good place. You probably remember it as one in the series of shootings. Jim's hometown is abuts it. It's just, across the road. So we have spent a lot of time there. And we got to know a group of young people called San Bernardino Generation Now. They started out as artists. They are artists. They started their work as artists, and they were determined to do what they could to make this town better. Ultimately, their mission was to educate the high school age kids in the importance of democracy and voting. They wanted to get out the vote in that town because they knew that's how they could ultimately change things. they did it their way. First, they were models going around to the parks to clean them up, painting murals on the sides of the building. They were like Pied Pipers. Soon the kids in town were kind of following them around and doing good things that they did. Then they branched out into having small festivals on Saturdays based around music and face painting and whatever they could to get people there. Then they took their video equipment and started to interview local officials or any officials they could find on the issues, but do it in a way that they knew could appeal to these young people. And then they went into the schools and showed these videos and started the conversations going. So it was something that grew out of the determination and love for that town, which was one of the most distressed that we've seen in all our journeys, to use their passion of what they could do to try to get things turned around onto a right track. And we saw that in many places. I would say we saw it in every town, and Jim will say, calm down.
We have a temperamental difference and a shtick. Deb says this is happening everywhere by all people, everything we saw. I'll say more places than not, we could see progress in this direction, so that you'll see that yin and yang in our comments.
As you think about that progress and you think about all of the narratives that we're bombarded with, what do you think we're not paying enough attention to? And what do we need to focus on as we think about constructing the world that we want to build one town at a time?
That's hard questions.
Yeah, this is pro ball when it comes to questions. So there's a challenge for, I know we're not the only people here who have media jobs. I think the national media have a particular responsibility and burden and blame, and therefore a possibility for improvement here, which is the national media by instinct treat a finite number of cities as places where things happen. New York, DC, Los Angeles, San Francisco, another few on the list, where we know the landscape of those because we've seen it a million times, and the people there are treated as independent actors, who are dealing with things. And most of the rest of the country, the default assumption is that things are happening to the rest of the country, whether it's economic changes or political trends or whatever. And that's aggravated by the instinct in media coverage to go outside the big cities for a disaster or a political campaign or a concept story, as opposed to sort of de novo saying, what's really happening here in San Bernardino, what's really happening here in Columbus, Mississippi, what is interesting in the way people live in all the dimensions of their lives. And so I guess the part that seems to me that we have tried hardest to convey in this book, and that we want to convey for the foreseeable future, and working with all of you and writing in different venues, is the fact that every community and almost every person is a multi-dimensional hero of his or her own life, who is facing these choices along the way and making independent decisions, and just the sort of drama and richness and active nature of much of American community life, as opposed to just the object nature of whatever is the trend people are talking about at the moment. There are trends you can't resist. The Dust Bowl was something people couldn't resist. Opioids now are a gigantic problem. But I think what people are missing is the vitality of America, even outside its 5 or 6 most famous cities, and having the same sort of richness of portraiture of that part of American life, I think, is what's missing to me.
One thing we heard when we were going around from town to town too was, in a number of ways, I'll take the library as an example. Librarians would say, we're the best kept secret in town. And they didn't want to be the best kept secret in town. There was so much going on in libraries that I know you all know about, from the various civic and social activities or the educational moves or the technology that they're encouraging and offering. And I know that in this arts communities in towns that you're doing the same things by trying to not be a best kept secret, but by trying to have your influence into other organizations or other parts of the structure of town, whether it's the police, services or connections with the schools or being in the libraries or whatever it might be. And I think being connected and meshed with the communities that you're in is something that is starting, but it's not full-fledged yet. In Bend, Oregon, there was a new director of the public library, and one of the first things he did was to do a survey around town to say, what do you know about your library? And basically people said nothing, and he was just horrified. So they decided to call the librarians, the community librarians, and tasked everyone to go join 3 organizations, the Elks, the Rotary, the Emergency Services, whatever it was. And by the end of a couple years, at the beginning, when a librarian appears at one of these meetings and they're kind of like scratching their heads, well, what are you doing here? What do you want from us? What can we do for you? And they formed these associations and these collaborations where, say, the AARP that was doing tax help would go to the library to do it and get some of either use their computers or whatever it was so that they could work together. And by the end of a few years, they had these associations with 50 or 60 different groups. And so I think, looking for creative ways, like I know that is part of what you do, but even more than that, trying to imagine beyond the imagination, to make those connections, to have the synergy. Everybody becomes a stronger voice that way. So.
I love that. I've been thinking a lot about imagination, and for those of you that were able to attend the Policy Link conference and thinking about Angela Glover-Blackwell's idea or reminding us of the importance of radical imagination and getting clearer about what we're for, as opposed to just talking about what we're against in this work. And so the next question is a softball, hopefully. I'm really curious, what are you both most excited about after all your travels?
Do you want to?
It seems to work well if you start. And then
So I'll give you a boring sort of textbook learning question here, but I'm genuinely excited about this. So to the extent I had any academic formation at all, it was studying American history when I was in college, long, long ago. And that's most of what I read, it's most of what I think about, it's most of the pattern that I see in American life. It's why we've loved living around the world. We lived outside the U.S. for a lot of years, but I'm often thinking in comparative terms about the U.S., and we've traveled across the U.S. Constantly. And what I'm excited about is the potential that everybody in this room and our allies, known and unknown across the country, are in right now as the actors in a crucially important historic drama. By which I mean, if we look back 120 years at the late 1800s, early 1900s, we see in that original Gilded Age almost every problem we're having now. Economic extremes, sudden fortunes from new technology, sudden dislocation, forces of globalization, corrupt politics, distrust for politics, all these things that were different in detail but very similar in shape 120 years ago to what they are now. If we also look back on the countervailing forces in those days, starting not long after the Civil War, we see the labor movement and the women's movement and the African American rights movement and the environmental movement and the good government movement and the social reform movement in the big cities and a half dozen other groups that weren't officially allied, but together make up what we think of as the progressive era and the seeds of the populist era, and things that by the time of Franklin Roosevelt, there were all these reforms that made the United States different. And I think that is what is going on right now. That I hope that people looking back 50 years from now, 100 years from now, will, number one, think that the struggle turned out in the correct way rather than the incorrect way, but also will look at people who are doing the placemaking movement and the community arts movement and the downtown movement and the career technical education movement and the local sustainability movement and just a dozen other things we've seen that we try to describe, they will think of all of us as having been the people who were reshaping the next stage of the country. So I feel like, as Deb knows, I often thought, gee, it would have been fun to be around in the 1780s if you were a white landowning founding father character, and you could, not so good in other categories. But if you were there with Hamilton and Franklin and Madison, that would have been very interesting. There is that kind of moment that I think we're all in right now. And its outcome is not certain, but it depends on what all of you are doing, what we're doing together. So I'm excited about the struggle for the future of America that we are all engaged in right now.
I can't top that, but I can kind of add on to it in that I happened to be at a meeting just after the 2016 election that the NEA was having in DC, and it was a very dark moment. And I think we've seen through our travels in the time since then that people are going through different stages of acknowledgement, from grief to anxiety to acknowledgement to grappling to determination to action. And in whatever silo we've seen that people operate, if it's in education or in the environment or in public institutions of all sorts or in departments of recreation, in the arts, which has kind of an edge, I think, because you have such ways of expression and are already launched into taking action, and it's this release of energy and focus that I would say we've seen a turn towards so much positive spending of energy, and it really feels like as Jim has said, it's a moment to move forward, and we see it from all different parts of the population, all different demographics, and it feels like a real genuine thing. We're not just talking here, that it's something we're seeing, and that is tremendously exciting and hopeful, and this group here is I think the most positive that we've run into, who are kind of speaking together in the same language. So we're really...
And as testimony to this is what we plan to do for the foreseeable stage of our when we grow up life, just to be involved with all of you and your colleagues trying to tell these stories, bring more attention to them, connect them, and swing this battle for the country's future in the right direction.
So as I think you two know, and as all of you know, we've had a number of readings that we've been doing to sort of ground us as a group and to be able to connect us both across our differences and across our similarities. I want to read a quick excerpt from one of the authors, Bell Hooks, who's one of my favorite authors, and just really excited to be in her home state. And then I have a follow-up question for the two of you after I read it. During more than 30 years that I did not make my home in Kentucky, much that I did not like about life in my home state, the cruel racist exploitation and oppression that continued from slavery into the present day, the disenfranchisement of poor and or hillbilly people, the relentless assault on nature was swiftly becoming the norm everywhere. Throughout our nation, the dehumanization of poor people, the destruction of nature for capitalist development, the disenfranchisement of people of color, especially African Americans, the resurgence of white supremacy, and with plantation culture has become an accepted way of life. Yet, returning home to my home state all the years that I was living away, I found there essential remnants of a culture of belonging, a sense of the meaning and vitality of a geographical place. And so I ask the two of you, where do you feel most at home?
So I grew up in a small town in Southern California, a town of Redlands. I don't know if any of you have been there. It was a little town. It was roughly 50-50 Anglo-Latino when I was growing up, with a small Black and Asian population. The Anglos had mainly come either during the Dust Bowl era or before that as sort of tuberculosis refugees from the East. And the Latinos had mainly come from Mexico, from the Mexican Revolution onward. And so my sense of place is is that part of, inland California is where I feel most at home, and the geography makes sense to me. But I'll say the way I'll actually answer that question, I would extend, granted that I am a man, that I am white, that I have all the other advantages that come with that background, what Bell Hooks says about her home of Kentucky is what I feel about my home of America. When in graduate school in England, or living in Japan, or in China, or in Malaysia, or other places, or going to the Philippines, I really thought that it was never clear to me that my essential identity is as an American. And with all of the tragedies and sins and offenses of this culture, but also this is the arena that I feel is my home arena, and it's my responsibility to use my time I have and powers I have to try to be involved in this arena.
My answer is more focused than that. I grew up in the Midwest, and there's a very strong sense of place there, that it is a wonderful place to grow up because you're so grounded. It's a wonderful place to leave because it's so flat and the same, that you have this drive that wants you to get out to see the rest of the world. And if you're from Ohio, you can go anywhere and you'll run into people from Ohio because so many people have gone out of Ohio. But there is a sense of, for me, how things smell. It smells like the earth, and it smells like the water. I grew up on Lake Erie. How it sounds with the air kind of blowing around. How people sound. You expect people to be nice to you rather than bite your head off. When I ride my bike a lot, and along the Potomac towpath where you're supposed to wear a helmet, if you don't wear a helmet, people will say, "Where's your helmet?" Just kind of screaming at you in a nasty way. And when we were in Sioux Falls, we were riding on the 20-mile bike path that goes around the town, and we didn't have helmets. And this very serious biker was going one way, and he turned around and he screeched to a halt in front of us, and I was like, okay, I'm ready for where's your helmet? And he said, "Are you lost? Can I help you? Do you need some help? Find where you're going?" I thought, I am home. This is how people act. This is how they sound, and there is just a sense of belonging, with the bad things that come with that too. The town I grew up in was entirely white. It was rich and it was poor. It wasn't rich. It was modest and it was poor. But I have that in my background to know, and it teaches me I have to go out to see the real world from that. But that is my narrower view of a huge imprint, like a duckling, of being from the Midwest.
I love that. So as we prepared for today, we wanted to make sure that we had time and space to be in dialogue with all of you. So we are now at about the halfway point of our conversation, and it's the time where we want to sort of open the aperture. You all have lots of experiences. You have lots of places that you're from and questions, and hoping that you can engage with us in conversation to try and take advantage of the rich stories and experiences that Deb and Jim have had across this country.
If you know how to fly the plane.
Oh, okay. No, this is Jim's passion. He is passionate about the plane. I'm a great right seat person. I know how to fly the plane. I can't see any of you. It's not the lights, I just don't see. And when Jim says, "Do you see the runway?" And I say, "Nope." You do not want me as your pilot, but I know how to pull the parachute. This plane has, did we say that?
No, we have not. So this plane is a Cirrus SR-22. If you have our book, you'll see on the back end papers, you'll see a picture of us in the airplane. It's now the most popular small plane in the world, built by two brothers who are sort of the modern Wright brothers in Duluth, Minnesota, because there's a parachute for the entire plane. So if you're going to crash, there's this little red handle in the cockpit.
That I can pull. Right?
And a rocket shoots a parachute out, and the whole plane comes down, And over the last 20 years, there are about 7,000 of these planes in the world. And the last 20 years, there have been about 70 times that's been done. Everybody's walked away. So that is...
And one more thing on that answer. So Jim is the pilot, and once we land, there's a lot to do. I am ground control. So everything that happens there, yeah.
Other questions? Right here.
A lot has been written, especially since the last national election, about the differences between sort of rural and urban areas. And I wanted to know if in your travels, if you found those differences to be as stark as is portrayed. And I also want to know what you think, if you found things that bind us in rural and urban areas.
Things that bind us? Yes. So we've thought about this a lot. We went to some really small towns, like Ajo is a couple thousand people, Eastport is maybe, Ajo is, yes, I represent Ajo, where we spent lots of times, and Eastport, Maine is maybe less than 2,000 people. We didn't go to many purely rural places. Going to places like Sioux Falls, which is sort of the big town of a rural area. We went to Spurville, Kansas. I don't know if anybody here is, this is a city that's spelled Spearville, but they pronounce it Spurville, and it's going through this transformation from a wheat farming area to a wind energy area, where they have wheat fields and all these giant wind turbines, which are paying for the school system and diversifying the farmers' incomes. But we didn't go that much to purely rural settlements. So we saw rural people when they came to the town, and I'd be willing to believe that the sort of purely rural opinion is as sort of different from big city opinion as we have heard, but it's not that many people who are purely rural. It's a relatively small proportion of the population. We found in smaller cities, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, where we spent a lot of time, if you ask them about national politics, which we never, ever did. But if that came up, then if say, what about Hillary? What about Trump? What about Obama? What about the Russians? It would be just like turning on cable news. And you would get just the script you'd heard a million times on mainly the right-hand side, but either the right-hand side or the left-hand side. If you didn't do that, then you'd get, again, people who were generally reasonable, generally practical-minded. And, for example, is there anybody here from Dodge City or Garden City in Kansas? These are, I can't see it. So these are places that are politically very conservative. Ethnically, the mix is shifting from mainly Anglo to predominantly Latino in a lot of these places. And in national politics, they would be very anti-immigrant, but at the granular level, they are having all these programs to finance, school systems for a mainly Latino school population, to have all sorts of cross-cultural efforts. And so you would think if you didn't ask national politics, if once you do that, there's no return. But if you don't do that, our impression was in small cities, people were still mainly practical-minded, mainly reasonable, mainly having some love component to their existence.
One curious thing about the towns that we went to, whether they were 10,000, 25,000, 65,000, and even the biggest city, Columbus, Ohio, was it 500,000? And not New York, LA, San Francisco, and so forth. Everybody knows about those. In all the towns that we went to, people would say, this is the perfect sized town. It's big enough that there's opportunity, that there are a lot of things going on, that there's a lot of potential, a great place to be for action, and it's small enough that I think I can have an impact here. I think I can get things done, and it's a place where I can practice what I do, and it will be worth something and noticed. Plus, it's affordable compared with other places. So there was this commonality of maybe not the, well, yes, even the tiniest places we went to, like Ajo and Eastport, that people we heard a sense of, I can participate here and make things better. And things can get better if we all do that.
Excellent. We have a question over here.
Hey, Ben Fink, Whitesburg, Kentucky, 2,000 people. And I actually wanted to thank you, Judy Jennings, former Whitesburg resident right there. Got a few from the area, East Kentucky. I wanted to actually pick up on what you just said, because I thought the point you made, Jim, earlier, I thought was really interesting about media representation. There's a few places where people are understood as agents and doing things, and the rest is where things are being done too. What I wanted to ask you is, as you talked with and listened to people in those other places, did you get that sense from them that they felt like it was history and politics and current events were being done to them, or did they feel, or to what extent they feel like they were acting as agents?
So that is another very interesting question, and I think it's sort of, our experience is it depends on both, there are variations in history, but also you can lead people in a certain direction. So, for example, there's the book Janesville that many of you have read about sort of the collapse of Paul Ryan's hometown after the financial collapse of 2008, 2009. What happened in 2008, 2009, like what happened in the early 1930s, was bigger than most people. You know, no matter how hard people were trying, lots of people were dragged down then. So there were times when people actually are objects. And there are people, we spent a lot of time with farmers in California and the Plain States where climate issues are things they have to adapt to. So there are some big things that do happen to people, and that they are bigger than individual agency. But it's struck us that apart from that, most people don't, by default, they don't think of themselves that way, as being just agents or victims. And by default, most people think they have choices in their lives, they're responsible for their successes and failures. You can take that too far, obviously, because there are social conditions that affect how we all exist. But we never ask people, gee, are you mad at either the liberals or the 1% for screwing you? We would say, what's happening here in Mississippi, and how are things changing in the town? How are race relations changing? How are everything else changing? So it was usually the case that people would describe themselves as sort of the main characters in their own lives, and occasionally they would have other people as sort of the antagonists, but mainly each of us is the protagonist of our own life, and that's how most people seem to describe themselves.
We have time for one more question over here, if we can get a microphone.
I'm wondering, as you traveled across the country and were, literally dropping out of the sky, how you maintained authentic conversations and were not the outsider looking in, but having an authentic experience.
Yeah. That's a very fair question, and I think we had a couple advantages. One is that we're both from small towns, and so it felt, when you ask where do you feel at home, I think we both feel at home in small towns and going there. And we spent a lot of time in these towns. We usually, as people in AHA will know, we paid repeat visits. We'd spend weeks in a town and often go back. So of course we're not the experts in the town, but if you talk to enough people and listen to enough answers, eventually there are themes and, I dare say, truths that seem to finally bubble up, and you hear the same kinds of stories over and over again, good stories and bad stories, that gives you kind of doing the best that you can do without growing up in each town or living there for long periods of time.
So again, it is a fair question. One way to think about the proportion of dropping from the sky and being on the ground is that the title of our book is a 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America. That's based on 500 hours of flying over about 4 years. So that's about 100 hours per year, or the equivalent of about 4 days per year in the airplane, and the rest of the days on the ground, seeing people. And my approach to this is, as a reporter, you're structurally always in the business of asking people who know more about a subject than you do and conveying it to people who know less about it than you do. That is your permanent arbitrage. And so the way that I try to manage this as a reporter is to say, here's what I heard, here's what I saw, here's what I think, Here's what I don't know. This is the evidence I'm presenting to you. And I think that's the way we tried to set it out. We heard this from this person. We heard that from that person. The white people we talked to said this. The black people said that. We got the impression of X. So it's just trying to present. We weren't just there in a diner for a day saying, are you still angry, or whatever. We were trying to be there for a week or two. You know, some guy with a cap who's with a Make America, well, I won't even go down that way. So I will need to say that I wrote a book after we lived in Japan about how to deal with the Japanese challenge. It was saying, don't be more like Japan, be more like America. The book's title was More Like Us, Making America Great Again. This was in the 1980s, so there. So we tried to spend enough time to have some beyond surface impression, but then just be transparent. Here's what we know, here's what we're guessing.
So I want to thank all of you for your questions. Our time is up, but I want to ask you to please put your hands together. And I do want to, before you do, beg to differ that you are both, in fact, artists in what you do. Listening is, in fact, an art. It's often a lost art that we are all exercising in our times and our seminars together today, and being able to really focus on amplifying the stories of those that don't get heard and giving a platform for others to tell their own story. And so I think that's really important for you two to know and to be able to hold on to. So please put your hands together to thank Deb and Jim.
Thank you all.